All right, you're good.
Yeah.
The nice thing
Check,
about this
check.
is once it's on,
Yeah.
it's super comfy.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. It is a delight to be amongst the special type of person who will spend a weekend evening doing this. Right, it's a Friday evening, but I want you all to like look around the room and just know that like these are your people. Okay, we have all chosen to do the same strange, cool thing together. So you have found each other. And on that note, when we end tonight, please feel free to. We'll have some like little. I don't want to overpromise or anything. There's like some little snacks in the lobby, and you're welcome to stick around for tea after the event and talk to the other people who chose to spend their evening this way. Yes. Yes, that's Alana's gonna monitor the live stream from there. Oh, the volume's on. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, folks. Sorry about that. On that note, we are live streaming this. There's a few logistical things for the live stream. The camera, just so you know, is pointed at the screen. So the people on the live stream can see the screen. They can see Sam. They cannot see you unless you rush the stage. Don't do that. It's never happened here before. That's not an invitation. Like, don't. They also can't hear you. So the sound that goes through the microphones goes on to the internet, but that's the only sound that goes onto the internet. So if you feel somehow like oddly compelled to shout your social security number into the room, like, don't do that because it might get picked up. Okay. And maybe save like the really super personal stories for the lobby time. But don't worry, your face is not going onto the internet. You can come and go from the room as you please. This is not second grade. You don't have to ask permission to leave. You are allowed to have tea in here, but what you are not allowed to do is to spill the tea. In any sense of the word, no gossip. We practice right speech in this room, and just don't. If you're walking across the room, just be mindful of your feet. Okay. We meditate a lot here, so that'll be our mindfulness practice for the evening, is not like drop kicking anyone else's tea. I think that's everything for logistics. Does anyone have any like sort of nitty gritty? Are we doing, do you want to be interrupted by questions, or do you want to go straight through and then do questions at the end?
Maybe we'll do it at the end.
Okay, cool. So hold your questions, maybe write them down if you want, and then we'll do questions at the end. How many of you are at Alembic tonight for the first time? Welcome. Wow. Welcome. So for those of you who don't know, we named Alembic very carefully. So an alembic is an alchemical vessel for transformation. And the alchemists believed that the substance you put into an alembic wouldn't transform unless you had set up conditions in the environment correctly. So they had the sort of science piece that way, but also in your mind correctly. And so, alchemy is this sort of thread from a time when science and magic and spirituality were all interwoven. And an alembic as a vessel is a place where mind and matter would meet to transform. And that's our aspiration for this space. So this container we're all in together tonight is this transformative vessel. And according to that goal, we run classes, workshops, events all around the themes of meditation, movement, somatics, dance, inquiry, scientific inquiry in particular. So we have a little EEG lab we pop up in the room next door. And we also encourage the kind of scientific way of thinking, open-minded, but not so open-minded that your brain falls out, that kind of middle ground. And then psychedelic culture. So we do a lot on the psychedelic preparation, psychedelic integration end of things. And we're coming here from the perspective of the psychedelic humanities. So the nebulous, the weird, the synchronistic, the strange end of the psychedelic culture. So I know none of that's interesting to any of you, because here you are on a Friday night. But the best way to stay in touch with what's going on at Alembic is to sign up for the mailing list, which you can do after the event on your iPad in the lobby. And it's an absolute delight to have Sam here with us again. The last time Sam was here was on my birthday, and I chose to spend it here listening to Sam, and I have no regrets about that. It was an awesome evening. I learned so much. And the relationship between Esalen and Alembic is kind of interesting. It feels like for Alembic, Esalen is like our cool uncle who, like, you know, he's been around like a little longer than us. He knows a little bit more. He's got some stories, he's got a perspective. And it really feels like that kind of relationship. So we have like, we even haven't, we love Esalen's motto of no one captures the flag. We use that here a lot. So Alembic and Esalen are like great friends. And Sam is the self-appointed historian of Esalen. And we are just so delighted to have you back. Sam, please welcome Sam Stern.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, thank you to everybody for coming out and spending your Friday evening here at the Alembic. It's such a it's such an honor that you would come intentionally to be here. So tonight I'll be talking about the decades that come after the decade that Esalen, I think, is best known for, the 1960s. A lot of time when we speak about Esalen history, it's almost like you could focus for the entire time on this like 1962 to 1969 period. But there's just an enormous amount of change and of history. So I realize that I'm in sort of the unenviable position of speaking about something where some of the audience members may know a bit more than I about this. I'm joined tonight by some really close friends of mine, especially my mentor, Ken Dykewald, who's here, who spent a great deal of time at Esalen. And yeah, it's really special to be seen and to be witnessed. So with no further ado, let's talk about how the 60s died. So principle, and by the way, isn't it interesting to look at that face and feel nostalgic, feel held by a good, sane person? The beginning of the end of the 1960s for a lot of people was the 1968 election of Nixon, who got swept in by the so-called silent majority of the time. And if the 60s were characterized by this idealism, this like free-floating idealism, then a lot of that was pushed back by the way that Nixon came into office. And when he first came to the presidency in early 1969, one of the first things that he did was declare drug abuse public enemy number one. So it was the beginning of kind of a war on drugs. And this was a bold statement because a lot of the idealism of the decade had sort of been stamped upon the psychedelic movement. And so he pushed back hard against that. And by the way, Nixon was aware of Esalen's existence, and it's safe to say he was not a fan. And then there was Vietnam, of course, which folks know about. You know, it began as this, what was thought to be a simple exercise in communist containment. But by the end of the decade, it had become this enormous moral and practical quagmire. 40,000 US soldiers had died by the end of the 1960s. And it had driven an ideological wedge between a whole generation of Americans. And it was a downer, let's say. Then Altamont. So Altamont Festival is sort of this symbolic occurrence that a lot of people point to as sort of the end of the 1960s, that along with the Manson murders, right? But Altamont, it comes, for those who don't know, it comes on the heels of the Woodstock Festival. Woodstock happens in the summer of 1969. Altamont, I believe, is in December of 1969. And by the way, I'm just looking at this picture. Why is there a 10-year-old boy wearing a hat? What is he doing at Altamont? And look at this poor schlub. He's completely ripped. Altamont was just a disaster in so many ways. There's a great documentary that's been made about Altamont called Gimme Shelter. I think it was made by the Maysles brothers, which is a great watch. And you get to see the Rolling Stones in all their glory, and you get to see the sort of disharmony of that festival, which was poorly organized. It was not actually far from here. And apparently 4 people died at the Altamont Festival, including one member of the audience was stabbed to death by a Hell's Angel who was working as security at that event. So it was this sort of, slap in the face of celebration, of joy, of idealism. And so the question I'll pose tonight is, if culture is sort of, reeling by the pushback against idealism, was Esalen at that time, were they nursing a collective bummer of their own? Because Esalen had really, it had gained a lot of the momentum of its center alongside sort of the dawning of the age of Aquarius, so to speak. So before I get into the 70s at Esalen, I want to talk a little bit about how Esalen made its bones in the 1960s. Like, what were some of the practices that characterized this really holistic and diverse retreat center that, again, was founded in 62. So one spoke on this wheel was psychedelics. That was a cornerstone of some of the intellectual and somatic explorations of that decade. And I think it's safe to say that while broader culture in a lot of ways embraced psychedelics recreationally, at Esalen, there was that as well. There was a recreational embrace of psychedelics, but there was as well this attempt to sort of unpack the import of psychedelics. From the very beginning, folks are getting together and having these discussions where they're attempting to understand why these experiences are enormously impactful for some. And everyone was there, from Ken Kesey to Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert. They're there in 1964 speaking about the ecstatic experience. And if you look at the bottom of that workshop description there, it does include the line that says, "No drugs will be used." It should have included in parentheses within the workshops. At that very week, the co-founder of Esalen, Michael Murphy, took LSD with Baba Ram Dass or Richard Alpert.
Well, in 1964, I took LSD then with Richard, but Tim and Richard were there together. Then we had sheets around us, walking around the grounds of Esalen, all of us on acid. I remember it as being very expansive in our behavior and in our proclamations. We were proclaiming this is the way it would be all the time, henceforth, where night became day and day became night. I remember saying that.
Such a beautiful guy. He is 94 years old, very much in compos mentis. If you are at Esalen and you happen to see Michael Murphy, I encourage you to go up to him, whether you've ever met him before. He is very open and very interested in meeting people, and he's very open to engaging in free-floating discussion. You choose the topic, he'll be there for you. So yes, I just pushing this idea, and by the way, he's not the greatest champion of psychedelics, although, I show this I show this clip. He probably only took LSD a handful of times. For him, the avenue of altered states of consciousness that he chose more so was meditation, and he was a very serious meditator and still is, and found his pathway to spiritual experiences through that. But for others at Esalen, yes, LSD was a path. I want to show a clip that comes from a staff member, a woman who still works at Esalen, Deborah Meadow, a very close friend of mine, speaking about the psychedelic culture that occurred at Esalen within the Esalen community in the late 1960s.
Psychedelics at Esalen were being explored by various people, and sometimes in a serious way, and sometimes in a more playful, experimental way. So we had a friend that had a birthday, and I made a cake for her in the kitchen. So I made a grass cake with acid frosting.
My colleague, Shira Levine, who I work with at Esalen, saw this video clip, and she was like, "I really want to know what happened afterwards." And I'm like, I think the people got very high. It was probably what happen. You know, and looking back at the 1960s, it's interesting to think about the decade that preceded it is so predicated around conformity and repression. And then the 1960s is so much about catharsis and exploding that shell that a lot of people carried around with them. And, you know, I think that there was, you know, in those days, it was common to take 400 micrograms of LSD, whereas somebody would take these days 75 to 80, right? And so in attempting to break apart the bonds that held people down, they used a lot of dynamite, and then sometimes probably too much. But that's a theme that we'll return to. So I don't want to give the impression that Esalen was this psychedelic center, because it very much wasn't. Esalen has always been this holistic place where there are a lot of different avenues, different practices to get towards probably a very similar goal, that sort of midwifing of the emergence of a true or originary self. And a lot more people came to Esalen to explore humanistic psychology, likely, than they did to take LSD or to talk about psychedelics in a high-minded way. Humanistic psychology was just this enormous, exciting right turn from psychology, because if you think about that field in the 50s and early 1960s, psychology is really dominated by two streams, two schools, and one being psychoanalysis, the other being behaviorism. And both of those schools are very revolutionary for their time, but they're also really individualistic. They're also hierarchical, and they're also rigid. So by the time that the 60s are rolling around, people are pushing back against established schools of thought, whether that's the civil rights movement that's happening, the anti-war movement. There's this new hippie thing around 63 or 64 that is powered by the psychedelics of the time. So psychology, too, is this arena where people are looking for something new and different. And a great big piece of that was being explored at Esalen in the 1960s. And that gentleman there who's engaging in his favorite oral fixation is Fritz Perls. And he's sort of the godfather of Gestalt, right? And Gestalt is this type of therapy, not to be too obvious about it, but it differs from psychoanalysis and behaviorism in that it is practiced in group. And so if there is a transformation that is happening, then that emergent self is being witnessed by a group of people. And it's simple, but it's profound. And it's a big piece of the Esalen puzzle. And those groups were an enormous drawing card to Esalen. And Fritz Perls was very much a famed individual. Encounter also was, I would say, like a cousin to that Gestalt work at the time, in that it was practiced in groups. But if the work that Fritz was doing was dramatic and exciting and somewhat out of the box, Encounter was all the more so. It was more anarchic. It was more based on this often confrontational sort of honesty. Let me show you a clip from a documentary that was made at Esalen in 1969 or 1970, which documents the Encounter group work of that time, and the most famous teacher, Will Schutz. This is called Here Comes Everybody.
Sit in front of the person, look them in the eye, touch them in whatever way you like, and tell them exactly how you feel about them.
I'm not sure how much is true and how much is an act. Like, I get the idea that so much of you is just an act. You know, like even when we were walking around feeling each other's faces, that you were just sort of inside sort of laughing.
You're cold, you're dead looking, you're dead acting. You come on to me with this cool facade. I think you're scared shit underneath it.
Maybe there's a little to unpack here. But again, I want to return to this idea that what people are coming out of is generally this place where they're not, it's not approved of to show all sides of the personality. And so by any means necessary, we're going to drag people, whether it's kicking and screaming, into this zone where a more authentic self is going to be on display. And so this sort of raw, rugged type of work, it probably wasn't for everybody, but it was for some, this full frontal assault if one had a strong enough ego structure, if one could say to themselves like, okay, that maybe that was projection, that crazy shit that you just said to me, and not take it to heart. But I have talked with folks who took part in the encounter group work at Esalen in the 60s and 1970s. And this is 50 some odd years ago. And they're telling me that they still bear the scars of the harshness that were spoken to them at that time. And I think that we have a more sophisticated understanding of trauma at this point. And there is work that's done at Esalen that is in the lineage of encounter. The focus on the body. Will Schutz used to say that the truth lies in the body, and there's so much there. And the dynamism of the groups, right? And the sense of drama, of entertainment, of excitement. All of that, I think, is really special, and that continues. But hey, we just live in a different world. Things, you can't go up to somebody and say, sit in front of a person, touch them in whatever way you feel like it. That just doesn't work. Now, I also want to be clear. I'm not saying that everybody came to Esalen to do the work and get serious and try to figure themselves out. I think a lot of people probably had no interest whatsoever in engaging in deep interpersonal debates. They were at Esalen to have a fantastic time, walk around in circles, dance on the deck there, in one of the most beautiful places in the world. And I think that's good. That's sweet. And we need more of that. But I will also say that likely in this world, by the end of the 1960s, hedonism for its own sake was starting to wear thin. This is also from Michael Murphy.
By 67, the summer of love in San Francisco, Big Sur was swarming with thousands of kids stoned and starting fires, and it was wild. And you could argue that in the late 60s, it boiled over. It's like a pot that boiled over.
That comes from a documentary that you can find on YouTube. It's called Big Sur, The Way It Was. Not the Michael speaking, but just that footage right there. But as you can see, I'm making this case, I suppose, that there was this sense of cultural hangover, right? By the end of the decade, by the beginning of the next decade. And you can almost see it on the leaders of the generation. So look at that. That's fresh-faced Alan Watts from probably 66 or 67. It's a picture I found in the Esalen archives. It comes from a wedding. So there's Watts, he's wearing a flower in his lapel. He's got the sweet love beads. He's got his purple tie on. He's looking playful, yet spiritual, just like serene, attuned to the moment. That's mid to late 60s. This is Watts in 1970.
If we continue as we're going now, where do you foresee the United States ending up? Nowhere. There won't be a United States in the year 2000. It'll be a barren, eroded country. It doesn't.
What a power move to be smoking at the television station. He looks, wow, he's having a rough day. So the 70s, this brings us to 70s. So I'm asking this question, where did Esalen find itself amidst this sort of shifting cultural landscape? I would say that without a doubt, one primary focus remained the same. So here is the historian and author and Alembic co-founder, Eric Davis.
The work of transformation that was engendered by the 60s, by the turn towards alternate spiritualities, new forms of body work, new forms of play, in a really core way involved the self. This question of who am I?
Yeah. So that doesn't change. There's no way that changed, because that continues to be the question that is being examined at Esalen now. I think what changed, though, was culture at large, right? And because, in a certain sense, the project of the 1960s had failed, the idealism the pin was taken out of the balloon, and you have this Republican president who's sort of laughing in the face of that. Culture began, in some cases, to make fun of that inward gaze. And a really great example of that comes from Tom Wolfe. And I love Tom Wolfe. He's one of my favorite authors. He wrote The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which was just like a staple for me. in my teen years of understanding what happened in psychedelic culture in the 60s. But in this essay, which he publishes in New York Magazine in 1972, he speaks of the narcissism and navel gazing of the culture of an Esalen, right? And Esalen is actually named in this essay, as well as he talks about primal scream. He talks a bit about est, and he kind of lampoons what he saw as a more shallow interrogation of self that didn't necessarily have ripples into larger culture. And although I love Wolf, the way he writes, I think that is actually wrong. I think that number one, there is a great deal of use for the examination of self. And I think it does have enormous ripples into larger culture. And I'm quite scared about what's happening in today's society, where that sort of interrogation of self is very likely going to be hamstrung. I think that while Esalen supported all sorts of inward focus, probably the indulgent sort and less so, that there was inquiry that was generally useful and very substantive. So one arena that I think we could point to for the 1970s is Esalen's engagement with women's rights. So throughout the 70s, Esalen made this contribution to what was a growing women's movement at the time by creating spaces and creating a sort of inquiry for women to explore their roles and their rights and their inner lives. In 1973, the Women's Studies program is created at Esalen, and I believe that it mostly happened in the San Francisco Center. I could refer to some folks in the audience for clarification, perhaps after. But until this focus, a lot of the work, a lot of the general ethos of Esalen, it had been male dominated, right? It had been just reflecting sort of a male-oriented perspective, and a lot of the leaders, the strongest leaders at Esalen, the strongest voices, not just at Esalen, but in greater culture. If you think about like the Yippies, who dominated that? That's Jerry Rubin, like he's got the loudest voice, or that other gentleman, Abby Hoffman, right? You don't think as much about the strong women's voices, but the Women's Studies program, it aimed to center female consciousness. And the idea, I think, was also to confront the systemic biases that had shaped the experience of all movements, including the human potential movement. So there's some really cool things in here. One name that caught my eye was Betty Dodson. She becomes well known for her role in the sex positive movement. But yeah, there's a host of courses and classes at the Women's Studies program at Esalen throughout the 1970s. And which is not to say, I think, that 70s Esalen was a space free of chauvinism, not at all. But I will say that this marked an evolution of thought, the beginnings where there's a sort of a cultural shift and a pushback and a reaching towards gender equity and a feminist inquiry, right? So I produced, along with my colleague Shira, this short documentary piece called Women of Esalen, where we spoke to 4 of the women who were there in the early days. This clip I want to show you features Mary Ellen Klee. She's one of Esalen's board members, a really interesting person who was at Esalen beginning in the late 60s.
At some point over the weekend, people said, "Oh, come on, we're going to go out to the point." And, I brought drums. I didn't know from drums. They started drumming and I started dancing. And I started dancing in a way that I had never danced before because there wasn't a mirror in front of me. And I wasn't being given prescribed steps to do. And that was just extraordinary. It was, I didn't even know that experience existed. Yeah, I don't know that I was seeking my own potential. I was just so happy to feel at home. I was a nice Jewish girl from Park Avenue. We didn't move to the mountains of Big Sur.
Mary Ellen is so charming and smart. She tragically, she lost her home in the Palisades fire. So she's really going through it right now. But if you're interested in seeing that longer piece, it's about 15 minutes, and you can just go on YouTube, search for Women of Esalen. And another woman who's featured there is my dear friend, Nancy Lunny Wheeler, who was in charge of programming at Esalen beginning in the 1980s. And she's fantastic. So more of the focus on the body at Esalen. That was a big piece from the very, very beginning. And there is an evolution, right? There's a continual evolution. And going back through the Esalen catalogs, I begin to see offerings for something odd and weird and fringe called yoga in about 1970. So this course, taught by Deborah Meadow, actually, the woman who was speaking so eloquently about the grass cake and the acid frosting. She is one of the early Esalen yoga teachers, along with a gentleman named Joel Kramer. And according to her, she got the gig by standing on her head in a semi-public way until one of the co-founders of Esalen, Dick Price, came up to her and said, "You're ready to teach." But it's just funny the way that, yoga has so completely mainstreamed in our culture that there's this Red Bull influencer just like casually defying gravity on a piece of driftwood. We're all used to it now, but it's easy to forget that at one point yoga was edgy and Esalen was kind of ahead of the curve as it tended to be. Another piece of the somatic exploration at Esalen was Tai Chi, represented in this 1972 short film that was shot at Esalen called Tai Chi in the Watercourse Way. And it features the longtime Esalen faculty member, Chungliang Ao Huang, who was a close collaborator of Alan Watts. This film was made right after Alan Watts' death. And this reflects this enduring sort of interest in Eastern philosophies and Eastern practices that Esalen had a hand in sort of bringing into the United States and mainstreaming as well. Beyond this, there is the whole New Age thing. And New Age is such an interesting term that certainly bears a little unpacking, and it bears some attempts at definition. And my own sort of like thoughts around what the hell is New Age is that it smells like incense, and it's in a corner of a bookshop, or there might be a bookshop just like dedicated to New Age. It's this thing that attempts to blend spirituality with a bit of self-improvement, as well as sort of like housed in this arena of esotericism, right? And by that, I sort of think of things that are odd. They're out of the ordinary, that we might not understand, but they are attractive for that very reason. And I will point out that Michael Murphy has always been really allergic. He's the co-founder of Esalen. He's always been allergic to that term New Age. He had just felt that it's kind of cringy, right? And he didn't resonate with him. But true to this ethos of no one captures the flag, he very much encouraged offerings of this sort to be part of Esalen. And at the same time, as you'll see, I think that some of Michael's interests were quite far out as well, or they were quite woo-woo, or at least woo. So this is an Esalen offering from 1970. So astrology is beginning to be, a big part of that sort of alternative culture. And it has continued to be a focus. Not that it comprises a big part of Esalen catalog offerings, but just in January, this woman named Heidi Rose Robbins was at Esalen. She was teaching about astrology, and people have a way of making it useful and even high-minded. I lived in Santa Cruz when I graduated from college. I lived there for a couple of years, and it was like, astrology is like the de facto religion of the town. I had a problem with it. And I never found a way to make it, useful for me. But it's with these New Age practices, it's interesting. It's sort of like one person will find, for example, the paranormal. That will be the arena that feels like that's real. Or like I had this experience with a psychic where they were channeling, and I could feel it. It was real. But at the same time, I don't cotton to astrology. It doesn't make any sense to me. So this inquiry, this focus on extrasensory capacities led by Charles Tart, including phenomena like telepathy, that kind of thing was of interest to Michael Murphy. He'd always been fascinated by this idea of exceeding the bounds of the body and exceeding the bounds of human consciousness, getting into the untapped abilities. And I think that what's interesting about Esalen is they blended a rigorous inquiry with questions that were beyond knowing. They knew they were going to fail in attempting to find the answer, but they opened up the channels of inquiry nonetheless. And there's something that's interesting and admirable about that, I think. So hypnotherapy, these are all from early 1970s. UFO phenomena, it continues to be this subject of inquiry at Esalen as part of the CTR, the Center for Theory and Research. They just had sort of a group of academics and experts gathering at Esalen to explore UFO. It has been updated, like to tell everybody, now it's UAP. And UAP stands for Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. But people are still investigating this. I interviewed for the podcast Voices of Esalen, of which I'm the host, this gentleman named Keith Thompson. Keith Thompson was crucial for the establishment, the early establishment of the Center for Theory and Research. And for Thompson, UAPs represent a call from the cosmos for humanity to open to greater dimensions of reality. So it's there for you if you want it, right? Also, during the 1970s, which I feel like is a branch of this interest in New Age and interest in the unknown and the unseen, the Esalen Sports Center opens up, and it opens up in San Francisco. And you may be sitting there thinking, like, I can't think of anything that's more mainstream than a focus on sports. But the way that Esalen investigated the arena of sport was to imbue it with this sort of background of altered state. In 1970 or 71, Michael Murphy writes this book about golf, and it's called Golf in the Kingdom. I don't know, has anybody read that in this room here? It's a good read. It's actually the best-selling fiction book about golf that's been published in the United States. He, I guess that's faint praise. I didn't mean it like that. It's very well loved by certain. Michael has this saying. He says, "Golf is mystery school for Republicans," and it's an arena where you can get into an altered state. And I think that's part of what the interest and the inquiry around the Esalen Sports Center was like. What if sports were being done and being experienced and being talked about in a deeper and more mystical way than they are usually done? So Michael was this, he looks like such a normie there, but he's not. He's not. He's this, enormously curious intellectual person who's produced not only a bunch of books and founded this transformational center, but he has produced arenas of inquiry and points of view that are unique and odd. So here's an example of a course that could be offered at the Esalen Sports Center. It would be golf and energy awareness. Again, yeah, there's this cuteness, there's a kitschiness to it, but there's this invitation to like, well, what if we really did think about it? What would happen then? This concept of the supernormal, right? The transformation of the body. Within this workshop description, there's mentions of psychokinesis, of meditation, of hypnosis, even of cyborgs and genetic engineering. So there's this sort of, I would say, ambitiousness to the level of inquiry that can be applied to a great variety of subjects. Here's something that comes from that time period, probably 74, 75, hypnosis and think training. I'll tell you right now, there's nobody in the mainstream sports world who's going to say that's garbage. It can be very useful, but I would imagine that at the time it felt kind of fringe. I don't know. And there's just something that I feel proud when I think about being associated with this institution, the courageousness to ask questions that in a lot of arenas are kind of laughable, right? But when one engages with whole heart and suspends disbelief, there's something deep there. And in any case, it's admirable to be doing this at a time when the general level of inquiry was blows like this. That's what was going on in the 70s in mainstream culture. And, so the bar wasn't super, super high. There was also and this is one of my favorite things to speak about, the Gestalt and the encounter work at Esalen. There was an evolution that happened. Fritz Perls dies in 1970 or 1971, and Dick Price, the co-founder of Esalen, along with Michael Murphy, he sort of takes up the mantle along with his wife, Chris Price. Dick had been institutionalized before he came to Esalen. He had a psychotic break when he was in the Air Force in the 1950s. And you know, the Air Force in the United States in the 1950s is not the best place to have a psychotic break. He was given an honorable discharge on the condition that he would go to a mental hospital. So they sent him to the Institute for the Living, which was a very posh mental hospital in Chicago. And over the course of the year, he's made to undergo all of these shock therapy treatments. So he gets over 60 insulin shock therapy treatments over the course of 12 months. And it leaves him for a time, this shell of himself. And it leaves him with this, crucially, with this profound distrust for modern psychiatry. So he is really crucial for the founding of Esalen, for it to be this alternate attempt to do psychotherapy and to treat people who are suffering, right? So the work that was being done at Esalen in the 60s was transformational. It was awesome. It was dramatic. It was interesting, but it was also raw, I think. I want to show you this clip that comes from a doc, like an unsung, unseen doc that was made in the late 60s. I managed to unearth it just going through VHS tapes in the Esalen catalog. I think it was somebody's UCLA like grad student thesis. But I found this clip that spoke about Fritz's work that I found was really interesting.
One thing that's been very hard for me is the general coldness here, the general toughness. Fritz's way of putting it is wipe your own ass.
It's a little rough. There was this idea of radical responsibility at that time. And it's funny too, because if you look from a really high bird's eye view at Esalen or a place like Esalen, the work that's being done, it kind of seems like, oh, it's kind of like warm and fuzzy, you know, it's sweet. But actually, when you get closer, when you took a look at history with a fine-tooth comb, it's harder to organize and things pop up that are surprising. And when I was reading this great book, it's called The Upstart Spring. It's my favorite kind of history book about Esalen, about the first 20 years of the human potential movement. It spoke about this element of Esalen in those days in great detail, this bluntness, right? Here's another great friend of mine, Dorothy Charles, speaking about the work that Fritz was doing at that time.
Fritz saw himself as an expert, as the doctor, that he had a privileged view of reality, if you will. You know, if the person was boring him, if the session wasn't of interest to him, he would, you know, pretend to fall asleep. So he had strong opinions about what was happening, and he didn't take into account how his presence and who he was might be influencing the work that was happening.
Yeah, really key stuff there. This idea of like, if you don't like it, fuck you. Number one, like do people have feelings? People do have feelings, yeah. But if the leader of the group is charismatic enough and decides to set the rules, then maybe we can pretend that they don't. And so it's sort of like a shadow side of some of the work that was happening there. Well, there was an evaluation of that and there was an evolution. So Chris Price was also an important part of this Gestalt evolution. By the time that 1972, 1973 rolls around, she and Dick are beginning to lead Gestalt programs together that look differently than the work that was happening in the 1960s. And it's probably not as dynamic or interesting or as controversial, but it has a respect for the nervous system. And it has a respect for the idea that the person leading the workshop is more of a reflector than a ringleader. And that the star of the show is likely not them. It's going to be the person who is doing the work. Let me show you a clip of Dick Price working. This is from 1976.
he held a larger space for somebody in suffering than anybody I have met since. And almost the deeper they were in suffering, the bigger he got.
And letting go. Long letting go.
It's really beautiful work, and there's something gentle about it that's fascinating. And Dick Price would go on to influence a whole generation of Gestalt therapists. And the gentleman who was speaking there about Dick's work is Stephen Harper. Another piece of sort of the evolution of Esalen in the 70s is Gabrielle Roth, who is sort of known as one of the founders of the conscious movement. Movement, is that fair to say? And I talk about Roth whenever I speak. She is just so fascinating. She came to Esalen in the late 1960s and began to do body work, but she began to do movement at the same time. She's really well known for a system that she finished developing in the 1980s called 5 Rhythms. And so for folks, I'm just curious if anyone has experienced 5 Rhythms. Yes, a lot of people here. That's great. Amazing. So you know that it's this system of dance which is highly authentic. It's highly cathartic. It uses movement to get to that place. And in a certain sense, that same place that folks are trying to get to through the encounter group work, through some of the psychedelic work, right? Through some of the somatic work. And it's at the same time, it is psychological, it is somatic, it is intellectual, and it is done in group. And one really cool thing about Roth is that she didn't like midwife the work that she would become famous for immediately. It took like 15 years for her to get to 5 Rhythms. And so for anybody who's out there in the audience who is nursing this creative project that you're like, God, it was supposed to be done in 2017. Why am I still writing this book? Why am I still working on this, what have you, this play, this program? Sometimes that's how long it takes. And the way that Roth worked was to put her ideas into practice. So I want to show you a clip from 1977 when her work is in this sort of like midway between becoming 5 Rhythms. And it's theater exercises, but it is emotive and cathartic.
You have to stick with rhythm. You have to stick with sound. I want your content to be, look at me, love me, shut up. I'm so glad, I'm so glad, I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad. I want your content to be simple. Because at the bottom of the river, there's only a simple statement. I'm so glad. Oh, should I get confused? You call it in your body! Because it's sad confusion! It just goes! It knows that you're not.
Right? That's the kind of work that I like to do. There's something exciting about it. And again, it's bent upon this concern of who are you authentically and are you willing to show it? Can we engage in practices? Can we alter our state of consciousness until those walls sort of start to come down? And if we can be brave enough to do this at Esalen, then maybe we can take it out into the greater world and feel comfortable like that. There's just something noble about that, I think. Another innovation that I love pointing out about Esalen is this gazebo school that was established in the mid to late 1970s. And the story of it is that, number one, is that Dick Price had a daughter. So it was like there was a need for a school. No, that's the truth. Number two is that there was a woman named Janet Letterman who had studied with Fritz Perls. And so she felt like, oh yeah, I do what you do, but I do it with kids. You know, this focus on present tense awareness, this focus on actually radical responsibility. There was a great deal of that at the gazebo school. This concept, this, you know, bizarre concept that children are people, right? And that you can speak to them in that way and you can give them responsibility and that it will add to their experience. I think that it really helped the mission of that school, that it was situated upon such beautiful land. It was one of the first outdoor preschools in California, I believe. And it was, this picture I think is from 79. And the cool thing is, it's still happening. There's my daughter, Roxy. She badly wanted to be in the talk. I promised her that she could be in it. So it's called Big Sur Park School now, but the ethos is the same, you know, that kids are outside all the time, rain, snow, or shine, and they're taking care of each other, and it just works. It's pretty fantastic. So another piece of the 1970s that I really love talking about is something that I like to think of as altered states of fashion. And I just want to go through a couple of pictures here. And if anyone from the audience shows up in the picture or not, you can talk to me afterwards and perhaps slap me in the face if you like. But there's a lot here, so I thought we'd get into it. Look at this picture from 76, 77. To me, it's almost like somebody threw a dart at a fashion magazine and hit a curtain catalog instead. It's like, hey, wear that. I love bell bottoms of the era, and these are, number one, they're the greenest bell bottoms that I've ever seen for sure. They're also like some of the largest, and they could actually double as parachutes, I think. Yeah, you got them. Amazing. Yeah, those to me are they're impressive. And then we have sort of on the other end of the spectrum, the hip huggers. Hip huggers are kind of like the pants that begin where your ribs end. And ironically, I don't know if you can see it, but she's wearing a cycling t-shirt paired with those pants. And I don't think it's unfair to say that nobody's cycling in those pants. There's Janet Letterman. She is the founder of the Esalen Gazebo Preschool, and she's got a powerful gaze. For anybody who knows Janet, she wasn't scared of anything. And I mean, wearing velour that vibrant, who would be? Poncho time over here. I have a feeling that those ponchos weren't made, they were manifested. And you know what's cool is that in Big Sur in 75, this was considered business casual. Here is a gentleman who didn't bring a drum to the drum circle. He just brought his smoke. If you'll notice, if you look carefully, he's got denim shirt, but he has a denim jacket as well. So he's double dipping his denim because nothing enhances your drum circle aura like a double dose of denim and a Marlboro 600. Yeah, and then this t-shirt I would pay a lot of money to wear, to be completely honest. I probably have in the past. But yeah, that's the kind of t-shirt. It doesn't just hug your torso, it whispers affirmations to it. You know, if a shirt didn't double as a quilting project in the 70s, were you even really dressed? This is cute. I like this. It's another double helping of double-breasted, double the confidence, double the polyester, the beige power move. And then we have this incredible shot. One of David Schiffman's group. He's the gentleman who's third from the left, but it's the scoop neck vests that I'm really interested in. Not just one, there's two. If you'll notice, this woman over here has gotten into it, so they're contagious. And then terry cloth for when you need an outfit that transitions seamlessly from poolside to primal scream. Because why choose between functional loungewear and emotional breakthrough when you can have both? We're almost done here because this is disturbing. Hey, Dad, what did people do before yoga mats were invented? Dad, are they having sex? Did anybody have boners? So there it is, folks. A little illustrated 1970s history for you, when wearing clothes at Esalen was less of a requirement and more of a polite suggestion that everybody ignored. Yes, thank you so much. And it even happened in the garden. So we did a little documentary piece about the formation of the Esalen Garden, and for folks who have been there, I'm just curious: has anybody been to Esalen in this room? Pretty much, a lot of people's favorite spot is the garden. I'm really proud to say that my wife Candace is the head of the farm and garden there now, and she and I met in the garden. So I have a really deep connection to that place. I'm just so grateful about it. But we made this doc last year about the formation of the garden, and the story that we got from a dear friend of mine named Pam Wolotka was that she was the girlfriend of Will Schutz, the encounter group leader, was that she just started spontaneously growing vegetables there because he would want to have dinner parties, and she wanted to have salad ready for the dinner party. So she'd be growing lettuce and be growing chard. And then she met a gentleman named Dick Horan who came up to her and said, "Hey, you ever thought about growing vegetables they could use in the kitchen?" And she was like, "Fantastic idea." And that's kind of how the garden began, and it has become this locus at Esalen for folks, guests and staff, to connect with the incredible Esalen land there. And it grew throughout the 1970s. By the end of that period, it extended to the north side of the property and became what is called the Esalen Farm.
We went into this whole sustainability thing. In 1977, the gas crisis in the country, so we need to rely on ourselves. There was no farm. It was just wild land, except for a small pot farm.
Of course.
In 1981 or 2, the farm opened up.
The idea was just to have some ownership and relationship to the land. There was this interest in taking the idea of self-responsibility a little larger than just this smaller definition of self.
Yeah, I love that. And speaking of this idea of the smaller definition of self, I think it's time for me to segue to the 1980s, right? And it's this, again, if you kind of subscribe to the bird's eye view of history, it is the beginning of an era that is more defined by a sort of capitalistic ethos. And you have the Reagan era, and it's this conservative political landscape where suddenly the environment is not necessarily going to be something that folks are going to be championing. In 80 and 81, you've got Pac-Man and video arcades kind of springing up, and you had this new, suddenly enormously popular television channel that would change the way that people consumed music.
Turn it on, leave it on. America, see the music you want to see.
I want my MTV. All right.
I want my MTV.
I want my MTV. Wow.
24 hours a day on cable TV.
I want my MTV. Yeah, too much is never enough.
So good. Oh, so good. I miss MTV. I miss videos. But yeah, it was showbiz coming and popping its head into culture. And speaking of showbiz, there was Ronald Reagan, who was the new president of the United States. 14 years previous, he had been the governor of the great state of California, and he was extraordinarily concerned about this new substance that was colonizing hippies and young people's minds and turning them into commie pinko liberals.
Well, I'm terribly frightened by the problem with LSD. I think there's been a great deal of misinformation by those who seem to see no harm in it. But as a parent and as a citizen, and certainly now in this position, I am greatly concerned. There is nothing smart, there is nothing grown up or sophisticated in taking an LSD trip at all. They're just being complete fools. Anyone that would engage in this or indulge in this is just a plain fool.
Yeah. People are going to push back. But people elected a guy like Reagan because he seemed to supply some answers, right? And after tumultuous 60s and a disappointing 70s, people wanted something clear and right and traditional and values that were reminiscent of another age. But not everybody wanted that, because at Esalen, I would argue that just the same way that the 60s didn't really die, the concerns lived on. In the 1980s, people were still enormously dedicated to exploring the esoteric, the unknown, and the unseen. And one of my favorite chapters of weirdness is Jenny and the Nine, who Jenny O'Connor was a psychic who held sway, a surprising amount of sway at Esalen from about 1980 until 1986. And Dick Price was a champion of her work. So I want to bring in the voice of another one of my great mentors and friends, Perry Holloman, and his experiences with Jenny and the Nine at Esalen in the 1980s.
When I first got here, Dick became very close, enamored of a woman named Jenny O'Connor. And she was in contact with beings from star system Sirius, according to her. She and Dick would actually lead Gestalt programs together. I did a number of those programs, and they were fascinating. They would ask, well, who wants to work? And then Jenny would say, okay, I'm just going to let the Nine come in and do a reading on you. Inevitably, there was something really provocative that was said to them. In fact, one time the Nine did a reading on me. It was something about how I defined myself as a man and my ego and all of this kind of stuff. And of course, I felt completely dismantled and taken apart after the reading, and then Dick would step in and work with people in that state. It usually went somewhere very productive. They were very interesting groups, and it was a lot of fun.
Kind of fascinating, if you ask me. Now, I wasn't part of those groups, but just the fact that, I mean, that's pretty far out. That's pretty out there, to not only channel the voices, but to take it as like, this is going to be a useful crowbar to open up the box of emotion. And yet there's a lot of avenues. Yeah. So to kind of sum up my thoughts around the esoteric, the unknown, and the unseen, I think this guy, Charles Tart, kind of said it well, in that he said, to believe that everything labeled psychic is true is stupid. However, to believe that everything labeled psychic is untrue, that also may be stupid. There is a middle ground there. There is an enormous amount of complexity, right? And sometimes in our society, we deeply want this binary, and it's just not the way that things are. Another kind of fun piece of Esalen of the 1980s was Joseph Campbell. He is loved and adored by many, many people. Campbell started coming to Esalen. Here he is, he's celebrating his birthday from throughout probably the 1980s until the time of his death, which was in the mid-1980s. He would come to Esalen every year for his birthday and celebrate his birthday. And he loved having a good time. He loved his whiskey, and he loved being adored by beautiful women. So he was in ecstasy. But, you know, he started to teach at Esalen in the 1960s. And he was so well known for The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Folks who are screenwriting fans are just all about Joseph Campbell when it comes to narrative structure. Famously, George Lucas uses the concept of the hero's journey to kind of shape Star Wars and whatnot. But one piece of Campbell that seems to follow him throughout culture is this idea of follow your bliss.
And I have a firm belief in this now, not only in terms of my own experience, but in knowing about the experiences of other people. When you follow your bliss, and by bliss, I mean the deep sense of being in it and doing what the push is out of your own existence. You follow that, and doors will open where you would not have thought there were going to be doors, and where there wouldn't be a door for anybody else. And there's something about the integrity of a life, and the world moves in and helps.
there's something there. There's definitely something there. It's inspiring. We can't forget this, to follow our bliss. There's so much time spent, I gotta pursue my career. I gotta get my money. I gotta be the man that my dad wanted me to be, whatever, all this stuff. And it's like, or you could try following your bliss and see how that goes too. Another piece of the Esalen of the 1980s, which I think is enormously cool. I wouldn't say that I'm like the world's expert on this subject matter, but it is something really to be proud of, is the Soviet American exchange program that became a central initiative for Esalen during the 1980s. And this is at a time when the Cold War, the beginning of the 1980s, Cold War was really at its height. So Esalen served as this bridge, and it connected American and Soviet thinkers and scientists and spiritual leaders to explore shared interests in human potential. And, there really were shared interests around there, and shared interest in the realm of expanded consciousness. Michael Murphy was able to make this connection with Soviet thinkers and scientists. And interestingly enough, it was the Olympics of 1980 that serves as a catalyst for expansion of this work.
Soviet troops were all over the place in Afghanistan today.
The action was met with condemnation from all around the globe. U.S. President Jimmy Carter issued an ultimatum.
And I have notified the Olympic Committee that with Soviet invading forces in Afghanistan, neither the American people nor I will support sending an Olympic team to Moscow.
So what happens is that a delegation from Esalen actually goes to the Olympic Games in Moscow in 1980. They attend the International Conference on Sports and Modern Society that was held in conjunction with the Games in Moscow. And they were featured speakers there. And while they were there discussing the role of the mind in peak physical performance, this is sort of a callback to that supernormal transformations of the body, that investigation that Michael was doing through the 1970s, it turned out that there was a lot of common ground. There were Soviets there who were investigating human potential and this idea of what they were calling hidden reserves. And Dulcie Murphy is a name that I just want to give a shout out to, because it was her work in citizen diplomacy where they engaged with these scientists and journalists and artists, athletes and political analysts. She was spearheading a lot of that, and she continues to do so. And the organization that she heads up is called Track 2. So if there's an interest there, look up Dulcie Murphy and Track 2, and you'll see the work that her organization is still doing in this arena today. Yeltsin, this is kind of a fun story. Esalen was able to sponsor a lot of initiatives, and one of them was to bring Yeltsin to the United States during the mid-'80s. So this is a picture of him, sort of a famous thing. He goes to Houston. He goes to this supermarket called Randall's. And while he's there, he's sort of wowed by the capitalistic excess, by all the Jell-O pudding pops. And apparently it's this breakthrough moment for him. And he would later write in his autobiography that it constituted an aha moment. And he says, when I saw those shelves crammed with hundreds and thousands of cans, cartons and goods of every possible sort, for the first time I felt sick with despair for the Soviet people. That such a potentially super rich country had been brought to a state of poverty. And I mean, maybe it's making a bit too much of it to say that Esalen had a role in bringing down the Berlin Wall, but that's the way I think of it. And this, I love, there's this spirit of boldness that Michael and Dulcie brought to the Soviet American exchanges. Same sort of thing by investigating these unanswerable questions. They brought dissidents, and they brought cosmonauts, and they brought former members of the KGB. This is my AI creation of a former member of the KGB down at a version of the Esalen baths. And not only did they bring KGB, they brought former members of the American FBI, right? And they engaged in conversation in intense debates that, as the stories have it, eventually gave way to a sort of glasnost, a warming. And it became to be what Time magazine would refer to as hot tub diplomacy. And this is my AI rendition of that. Yeah. So next time somebody says to you the AI is shit, just don't tell them that it's not. Another piece of the Esalen 80s was that there was an interest in midwifery, which Dick Price was interested in and helped support. Stan Groff, too, is a name that I think it really bears mentioning. From 70 to 84, he and Christina Groff, his wife, were sort of the scholars in residence there. So Stan is the godfather of psychedelic psychotherapy, and he brought people through thousands of LSD trips from a therapeutic perspective in Czech Republic in the 1960s. By the end of that decade, he didn't have a place to live. He had to leave the country. He comes to Esalen, and Michael Murphy offers him to stay for a weekend. He stays for 14 years and develops holotropic breath work, which is sort of a non-plant-based or chemical-based way to alter one's consciousness within a therapeutic model. So again, all these different avenues towards the same goal. I see people in the audience are pointing to themselves. I too, pointing to myself, a bit of an evangelist for holotropic breath work, and just a fascinating person and a center of gravity, bringing a lot of fantastic people to Esalen to engage in these month-long programs. Another piece that Stan worked on during the 1980s in conjunction with Dick Price was the Spiritual Emergency Network. And the Spiritual Emergency Network aimed to be a non-chemical and non-medical intervention for folks who are suffering from a psychotic episode.
So there were a number of times in the Esalen community where somebody actually went into a psychotic episode. He set up 24-hour sitters for those people. And it was the idea that this break was actually the organism trying to heal itself. Our job when we came in to sit for our 4-hour shift was to just be present with the person. No analysis, just to be present, protect them from any physical harm. And the idea with that was that, we're not stopping the process. What if we make this assumption, as other cultures did, that maybe this is some type of spiritual emergence?
So again, I think that this work is profound. I think it's ambitious. I think that it is not done now, that it's not necessarily safe. Again, we sort of live in different times. We live in a more complex society where things like this, it could never work for an institute that's attempting to be safe, right? However, some of these practices, these bold practices, probably were enormously therapeutically useful for some of the folks who engaged in them. And it's that spirit of experimentation, which is so fantastically interesting to me. And part of that idea of madness, right, as potentially a useful state dates back to some of the work that folks were doing at Esalen in the 1960s, including R.D. Laing. Just wanted to call that up. So we're coming to a close here. I just have another couple pieces of the threads of the 1980s. I'm sure that I've left out many pieces of the puzzle, but it's impossible to get it all in there. And there's just this enormous amount of shared history at Esalen. I often think that there could be a people's history of Esalen, all the stories that people experienced across time. We know about Alan Watts, we know about Gabrielle Roth, but we don't know about person X, from San Luis Obispo, who came to Esalen and had an earth-shaking experience that ended up changing their life and transforming it. But I will show just a few more clips, including the Nigerian drummer and educator, Babatunde Olatunji, who graced Esalen throughout the 1980s. Olatunji was connected with Gabrielle Roth, and a lot of the work they did was in conjunction. And she thought so highly of him. Now I want to show a clip that comes from sort of a mainstream view of Esalen. This is from Good Morning America. Again, I found this just by thumbing through VHS tapes from the 1980s. But Good Morning America visited Esalen, visited Big Sur in '86.
I feel like I can do anything I want here.
We have a very special community here, and sometimes we allow ourselves to let loose and be crazy.
Each morning they have a weather report where they're encouraged to express themselves in many ways.
I feel like I want to scream.
All right,
Go, get it, man.
So the more things change, the more things stay the same. Right? I mean, I feel like I've been that work scholar in the farm and garden, so desperately in need of not just screaming, but to be screaming in a group. You know, like there's a difference there, to be held, and just to be part of a movement of people who are attempting to do something that is greater than themselves, that is greater than the aims of a society that can feel kind of limited. And even if they're probably not going to find the gold at the end of the rainbow, it's the journey that matters. It's the feeling of being seen, being heard, and being known. Thank you. So we can have a Q&A. I'm less fond of the Q&A format when it kind of like makes me be a person who's accountable for speaking on Esalen's behalf, because I like my historian role more so than feeling like what I say represents Esalen, because in truth, I'm not a member of Esalen's leadership at all, and I like to be unaccountable. So what my request is more that when people offer their, when they speak, it's more of a statement, like, this is your time. This is your time to shine. That's my request. Ken Dykewald.
That was extraordinary. You're amazing. No kidding. Wow. Your choice of words and language, there's only one picture that was inaccurate. You showed encounter groups. That was Bernie Gunther, and that was not encounter. That was a sensory awareness workshop very early on. But that was the most masterful characterization I've really ever experienced of anybody doing that. So proud of you.
Thank you, Ken.
I agree with that. I mean, it was like this beautiful home movie of the whole era. And you really captured the spirit of it and communicated it beautifully. And it was wonderful to participate in that with you.
Where is this?
This is like...
It's out on the lawn. Yeah.
Yeah, the pool would be over there and the lodge would be kind of over here.
The big house.
The big house is up there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just the angle.
The point houses are knocked out.
Yeah. Love to know just a little bit about the Esalen archives and like what the project is there. On that.
The Esalen Archives is quite the project that has eluded the it has stymied many a person across the years. It's tricky. Yeah, it's tricky. So I hold it loosely. It consists of a lot of videos and a lot of audio. Probably the most interesting and special part of it is some of the audio that was recorded at Esalen, because there was a gentleman named Paul Herbert from the very beginning of Esalen was tasked. He was like, he was an audio visual kind of geek of that time, and he recorded quite a bit. Just recently, I went to a storage facility that Esalen has near the Monterey airport. And I was like digging around in there, and I found this big box of reel-to-reel audio. And myself and Shira kind of cherry picked like the 50 coolest audio recordings that we could find. And I found this gentleman in Monterey who digitized these like old reel-to-reels. One of them is Michael Murphy interviewing Alan Watts from the mid-60s. There's Stan Groff speaking about LSD research. There's this gentleman named Paul Bindrum, who was an encounter group leader. Nude encounter was his thing. And I've just gotten these back. So there's a lot of listening that I want to do. And I'm intending to publish some of those in their like whole form on the podcast. Cool. Something cool about that. And I believe that a lot of the Esalen archive exists in the diaspora, that we don't actually have possession of it. I mean, there's really not that much film that I've been able to locate from the first decade. There's not much from the 70s. There's, if you're lucky, you can find some interview where Moshe Feldenkrais is talking on the deck of Esalen in the 70s, or you see like Milton Traeger doing Traeger work. There's stuff, but it's not enormous and it's not necessarily well categorized.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yes, George.
I didn't realize that there were so many programs in San Francisco at that time.
Mm-hmm.
I somehow thought that it was pretty limited to the property. But you mentioned a good number of things that happened up here at the Unitarian Church in Union Street.
There was a San Francisco Center, right?
Yeah, it only stayed around for a few years.
Mm-hmm.
There was the belief that there were some other centers opening around the country. There was a whole catalog of growth centers, and Esalen thought we ought to have a place in the city. And there started being workshops and talks. But then a lot of people said, heck, if I want to be a part of Esalen, I'm going to drive 3 hours and be on the land. So a couple, 3 years maybe.
Oh, just 3 years.
Just a few years on Union Street. And there was some kind of a building across the street that was large enough to hold programs. But it struggled.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of time I think about why did Esalen survive for this long? It's like, because it's on this sacred land. It underwrites all of this weird work that people are doing. Well, they can walk outside after this earth-shattering holotropic breath work or challenging encounter group work and be grounded by the land, or to go down to the tubs and sweat it out, and it all seems to make a certain amount of sense. And it's just, that's not as easy if you don't have the container of the land. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much. I was wondering what brought you to Esalen as it relates to like the history of Esalen and the questions that you were asking, that Esalen was asking in its like thinking about like the era now, what sorts of things you feel like the active history like you're a part of. That makes sense.
What brought me to Esalen was that there was a work scholar program there at the time, and it has kind of gone in and out of being part of Esalen, but you could go there for a month and work for 32 hours a week. You would pay a certain amount of money. I think it was $1,000. This was back in 2010. And I worked in the farm and garden, and it was during a transitional period of my life when I was having a lot of problems finding my feet. And it was a godsend. I was just thinking about it the other day about how much it changed my life, how grateful I am for getting the chance to go and be with a group of people. Up to that point, I'd been very like kind of lone wolf type of person, individualistic. And I just was so annoyed about being in large groups of people. But in my time of need, it was such a godsend. And being able to like have that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, have the bottom layer of my pyramid taken care of, where I had my food and my shelter and friends and a tub and a job. It was great. And I liked it so much. I like tried to stay. I was able to carve out a niche for myself. But you asked something about
how it relates to like the way that Esalen was responding to time, like of the 60s and 70s and 80s, and like what you feel Esalen is responding to now as someone who's like been a active part of the history.
Oh yeah. Gosh, well, that's a tough one. You know, like what is the character of now in this postmodern age that we live in? It's kind of a choose your own adventure. And there is still that community aspect of it that's available. And it's still predicated around transformation if you want it to be. It is not as experimental and freewheeling. And if you have a psychotic episode at Esalen now, you need to go. It's really disruptive. But in Dick Price's time, he actively encouraged folks to go there, right? So I still think it's one of the most special places to be, but I don't think that it's as connected to that ethos of like, let's try it. Let's just throw some spaghetti against the wall and maybe we'll have maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. I think they're safer now.
Did you come across any connection between Werner Erhard and Est and how that permeated, the entire country, if not the world? I know he had done a lot of work and across a lot of different disciplines and sort of integrated it into the Est training. I'm not aware of how much you touched down in Esalen or if you did it all.
You are correct. I think that he was inspired by the encounter group work. He was there in the 60s, early 70s. He even, I think, taught a workshop at Esalen. But his work, his creation
Joe
of...
Rosenberg then.
What's that?
He was Joe
Rosenberg. Okay. Figured some things out. Est was in some ways inspired by the encounter group work, but what he was able to do was sort of package it and put it in sort of a format that was done in conference rooms and was mainstreamed and made a great deal of money. And I think that not all of the practices of Est were necessarily like responsible and kosher, but Est would like have lots of splinters of its own. I was just speaking with somebody yesterday who had done Landmark, and Landmark comes out of Est, and Est, comes out of Encounter comes out of Gestalt, and it's all sort of interesting pieces of the puzzle. By the way, there's a bit about Est and Encounter in this Adam Curtis documentary called The Century of the Self, where one of my favorite documentarians, and I often show clips from that film. It's a wonderful sort of investigation of the emergence of self in post-war America.
It's a fabulous series.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I'm curious what things are on the cutting room floor here. And again, for me, I was a little sad not to hear you talk about Gregory Bateson and Entourage and how that might be there, but that makes me mindful that there must have been other Batesons or things that you had to leave out, and not that you have to go into it all.
There's a lot really on, and the reason that I don't talk about Bateson is because, to be completely honest, I just don't understand his work. It's complicated. He's an anthropologist. He's a father of cybernetics, as I understand it, but I've not really been able to apprehend Bateson all that well. Along with Bateson, John Lilly is a character who I think is fascinating, a big part of Esalen of the 1970s. And I often show funny, weird clips from this documentary. I found it on YouTube called The Dolphin House, where it talks about his attempts to establish interspecies communication. Likewise, Terence McKenna. I mean, we could do an hour. We could do an hour and a half on Terence McKenna. Richard Feynman. Last time I was here, I was speaking about Richard Feynman and his work at Esalen in the 1980s. It's fairly littered with wild practices and wild and impressive people. Just like that gentleman who I mentioned, David Schiffman, was just a random person wearing a scoop neck vest, I guess, but in those pictures. But the work that he did in Encounter, nobody ever really talks about him. Nobody gives him, a lot of love, but there's a whole chapter that he's the person who offered the most workshops at Esalen. So again, a people's history. Yeah.
There's a nice verse about Esalen and stealing fire that Jamie Whelan Cobler book, you know, that book dated now from 2017. Is J.J. Jeffries still there?
He had just left. Yeah, he's been there for a really long time, and he'll come back and teach workshops, but he is not as much a fixture as he has been.
Yeah.
Was he a part of your Esalen experience?
He truly was, and I just want to say thank you for this, and thank you, Olympic, for hosting this. I feel privileged to have been able to go to Esalen pre-pandemic a couple times since. J.J. Jeffries, his musical chakra meditation got me through the pandemic.
Wow.
With a lot of other things, but I came back to it after many, many years, and then the last couple of times I've been, he wasn't on site. So.
Yeah. Well, great. Yeah. Thank you for presencing him. He's a special piece of Esalen.
So you mentioned, you know, Esalen's gotten a lot safer over time, and I think this is you start an institution, and like this is what happens. You know, it gets less spaghetti at the wall, and it gets more like, oh, okay, we do this, we don't do that. But Esalen's a really special place, and at the time it was started, there were also a lot of people trying to do stuff like this. And there have been a lot of people since who try to do something like that, and some of them don't last. And what do you think it's a characteristic of the founders or the land or the community or the network, or like, what do you think has gone into Esalen being this vital place for so long?
What a great question. I have thought about it, and like I said, I think a lot of it has to do with the way it is situated. You know, just going to that land. You know, I went there during the pandemic when there was almost nobody there, and it was still pretty special and pretty magical. Just being in Big Sur, you don't even have to be in Esalen. It's pretty amazing. But also that ethos of no one captures the flag, I think it was fantastic. And part of that comes from Michael having traveled to India after he had his spiritual awakening and dropped out of Stanford. He went to India to study meditation. He ended up at the Sri Aurobindo ashram, where he says he was vaccinated against cult, because there was this sort of cultish vibe at the ashram. And when he was given the chance to start this center of his own, he was very much did not want that to be, you know, this strong, harsh leadership. He didn't want that at all. And the diversity of the place has made it harder to kill. You know, I guess it's there's something to say for that. And there's probably other reasons why it has flourished while other retreat centers, I don't know, maybe other people have ideas.
I think that what you just brought up about not wanting it to be a cult is sort of the bedrock that helped this flourish in the way that it did.
Yeah, they happen to be two very responsible leaders. And you look at a lot of other places and you see this guru thing start to happen, and we were lucky.
It could have gone
very
really
lucky.
that way easily.
Very much so. Yeah.
But they were very much into the evolutionary process.
Mm,
So
mhm.
it was always changing, and it was always in flux, and
Right.
there was so much movement that was always welcome and happening anew. Yeah.
Love that. Yes.
I'm going to add something that's often not mentioned for those of you who have not been. And I lived at Esalen from 1970 to 74, so I've got a long history with the place, the people. And I would say when Sam came along, the old timers felt that he was sort of like, could have been there in 1964, 1989. Sam was special. Oh, he is special. The nights. People seldom talk about or show pictures of the nights. You can get there when there's no moon and a clear sky, because there's no ambient light in Big Sur. You will see the galaxies dancing in a way you've never seen anything like that. The nights are not given their place in Esalen story.
But if I can chime in.
Yeah, great.
I was staying in the Murphy complex, which faces the water. It's one of the dorms. And there was the fullest moon.
Oh.
And when the moon, we stayed up as late as we could watching the moon. And then as the moon was setting, the moon set over the water, literally came through the curtains and woke us up at about 2 in the morning probably. And we had to just get up and just sit in awe at the on Golden Pond that became that the Big Sur Ocean became.
Wow, love that.
Wow.
Yes.
So I'm wondering when was the shift between kind of Coast beginning and then World to today, where it seemed very highly curated. My sense is to teach them, I have to write a book, you have to know a lot of workshops, you can't just show up and move in for 14 years. So
Right.
Now it's more,
Gradual, wouldn't you think? Gradual type of
when
thing.
it started or
Well,
what changed.
back in the 60s, famous movie stars used to go to Esalen all the time. And there was no cell phones. There was anonymity there. In culture today, there is not anonymity. And what a teacher may do that is experimental, daring, or dangerous can get them fired now very easily. Different world. So this type of thing, it happens slowly. And Esalen probably evolves in its own way, but Esalen is not apart from general culture. And culture has evolved and changed. And can you think of anything that is weird and wild and free? People didn't used to get paid very much at Esalen. I don't know when they started giving their workers benefits, but I would imagine that in the first 2 decades of Esalen, it was just sort of like they're writing down in a ledger somewhere about what people are making. Over time, it has become an institution and a business, and many times Esalen has had financial challenges and difficulties over the course of the years, and at a certain point, they started electing people to be CEOs to run the ship who actually knew how to run a business. that changes the way that a place is programmed, right? So we have to make peace with the reality of the world if we want to continue to help people transform. Yeah, if we want to continue to be around.
Can I ask a follow-up? I remember reading something, I forget which paper it was on, but they talked about the influence, now you mentioned of tech and all the techies coming.
Oh, yeah.
That could change things a lot too.
That could change the vibe, the amount of, I felt like that piece that was in the New York Times, and there was another one that was in the New Yorker that was kind of similar, that wasn't necessarily a fair portrayal of the way that Esalen feels all the time. But certainly if there's a price point for an institute, then if it rises as things happen, like in the pandemic, things just changed, so that changes the character of the folks who can come to a place.
You mentioned the archives, and I'd heard that it had burned, or some of it had burned.
I think what you're thinking about is in Carmel, they had a certain amount of the Esalen archives, and yeah, some stuff burned. It wasn't all of it. No, not at all. No, but part of that was Terence McKenna had left his collection of books to Esalen, and a couple of years after that happened, and the entire archive, all of his books burned, unfortunately.
So it's mostly his.
No, it was a lot of
Other stuff as well, but luckily some stuff survives. But it's kind of hard to know what was
there before.
What was lost. Yeah. Let's do a couple more, and then we can enjoy one another in smaller conversations.
I have a question for you. So you were not there in the 70s or 80s, but you have studied it and have framed it and have come to make sense of it with nuance. Do you have any regrets that you were not there?
Yeah, of course.
Who would you have been?
Yeah.
Who would you have been back then?
I would have been interested in the encounter groups. I like that raw brutal, exciting honesty. I have done some workshops at Esalen that are like in that lineage. There was this workshop called Radical Aliveness that was taught by Anne Bradney, and it used a lot of the somatic kind of like techniques. Like there are these big blocks that you can, she had boxing gloves in there, and you put on the gloves, like start punching and start kicking these blocks. And people didn't wrestle in Anne Bradney's workshop, but people got into it with each other, and it was held in this really lovely and safe way. And it was the most transformative, fascinating work. And, I was just felt hungry to do more of that. And yeah, I wouldn't have minded taking acid with Timothy Leary either. That could have been fun. That could have been interesting. Or Dick Price.
I asked Michael if that was his first acid trip when he did acid with Leary and Ramdas, and he said no, his first acid trip was with Aldous Huxley.
Yeah.
Oh. How many people living today can make that comment?
Good company.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been so great.
Thanks again, Sam. And for more, check out the Voices of Esalen podcast, which Sam hosts. I forgot to do announcements at the beginning. I always forget something, so I'm going to do them now. I'll tell you guys 2 things that are coming up, and then we can adjourn for tea. Next Wednesday, February 5th, is the next installment in our monthly psychedelic salon called The Chalice. Much like the description we saw earlier, do not show up on drugs. People ask me that sometimes. They're like, it's a psychedelic salon. So I no, it's a panel discussion. Like, please, there are better places to take acid than a panel discussion. But on Wednesday, Maria Mangini, who was once kicked out of Esalen for throwing a temper tantrum on the lawn, which you can ask her about on Wednesday. It is her 75th birthday. And we are having a small birthday party for her, which she has jokingly internally referred to as, you've heard of flower children, this is flower crones. So she's bringing Jane Strait and another one of her friends, and they're each going to give a short presentation, and then we're going to have a little panel discussion that I'm going to moderate. And we'll have a wide-ranging discussion, but part of it will be a focus on women in psychedelia. So that's Wednesday at 7 p.m. And the first Wednesday of every month is the Chalice, which is our psychedelic salon. And I think you all in particular would be very interested in that. The following Wednesday, we have Kathy Coleman here, who just released a book about her late husband, Ralph Metzner. And we're doing like a little book launch for her. And if you look at the table of contents for this book, she had a bunch of different people write little memories of Ralph, and it is just like this luminary author list, and many of them will be here. So that's 2 Wednesdays from now. She is his widow. Her name is Kathy Coleman. Yes. And she is, if you have astrology questions, I will tell you, astrology does click for her. She taught us a whole workshop on astrology, the I Ching, and like various forms of divination. So she's like, if you don't know who she is, she's very into divination, but she has also worked in like academic institutions for most of her career. So she's like a walker of multiple worlds in a very interesting way. So that's 2 Wednesdays from now. And Alana, when is Kat Harrison here next? February 23rd, we have Kat Harrison, who I hate to do this to women, but it is kind of her claim to fame. She is Terence McKenna's widow. So she will be here on February 23rd. And what's her workshop called that day? Cool. So Dreaming the Cure. And it's so Kat's here about once a quarter, and she does a different workshop every time. And once she brought us all these plants from her garden and like told us about the plants. It was amazing. This one is called Dreaming the Cure, and it's about healing modalities that we may not have been exposed to previously in the West. Yes, so it's a twofer. You can come to Kat and stay for dinner. Okay, so as you can see, there's a lot going on that I think will be of interest. So sign up for the mailing list. I hope to see some of you at the Chalice on Wednesday for, don't call it flower crones, but that's what it is. So 7 to 9 on Wednesday. Okay, and so I'll see you on Wednesday. I hope some of you, and I will see you in the lobby. Thank you again, Sam.